The first thing a man noticed was not the danger, it was the quiet. The kind of quiet that settles over open country just before the land changes its mind. A horse stood with its head low, breathing dust through tired nostrils. The saddle leather was warm from a long day under the sun. Far behind him, the herd had gone still, too still, the way cattle sometimes did when something moved through the air before any human ear could name it. Ahead, the earth dipped into a dry wash, smooth and pale beneath the last light, shaped like a place made for rest. A tired rider might have looked at that low ground and seen shelter from the wind. He might have unrolled his blanket there, loosened his belt, thanked the fading sky for one easy mercy, and slept. But an old cowboy would have stopped at the edge and looked harder. He would have studied the walls of that shallow channel, the bent weeds caught in the brush, the polished stones, the thin line where old water had once climbed and vanished. He would have known that rain did not need to fall on his face to kill him. It could fall miles away, beyond ridges he could not see, gather itself in darkness, and come down that empty wash like a black rope of water. That was one of the first forgotten rules of cowboy survival. Never camp in a dry wash. The land had memory, and the men who lived long enough to grow old learned to read that memory before they trusted comfort. Survival on the range was rarely about one heroic moment. It was about the small decision made before the danger arrived. The quiet choice to sleep higher, to tie the horse where the ground would hold, to keep the fire small, to listen to the wind as if it were speaking in a language older than words. The cowboy life remembered by movies is often polished into romance. But the real life was made of thirst, animal breath, rope burns, dust in the teeth, sleepless nights, and rules learned from people who had already paid for mistakes with blood, hunger, or grief. A cowboy did not survive because he was fearless. He survived because he respected what could destroy him. He respected weather, distance, animals, water, darkness, loneliness, and the terrible speed with which a normal day could become a test. The open country did not forgive carelessness simply because a man was strong. A strong man could still choose the wrong camp. A brave man could still ignore a lame horse. A proud man could still ride past water and regret it before sundown. That is why the old rules mattered. They were not decorations from a lost world. They were instructions written by experience. Some came from Spanish and Mexican vaquero traditions, some from indigenous knowledge of land and animals in certain regions, some from black cowboys, ranch hands, trail cooks, scouts, hunters, settlers, and working people whose names were rarely carved into history. Together, their knowledge formed a rough education in staying alive. The second rule was simple enough to sound almost cruel until the land explained it. Water your horse before yourself. A man could be thirsty enough for his tongue to feel like leather, but if he reached a waterhole with a tired horse, he had to remember what carried him there and what would carry him away. A horse was not a machine. It was a living companion, a partner in distance, a creature whose strength could mean the difference between returning home and becoming another shape lost in the grass. A wise rider watched the horse's ears, its step, the wetness of its coat, the drag in its breathing, the way it lowered its head near water. He knew that caring for the animal was not sentiment. It was survival. On the range, selfishness could kill a man slowly, because everything that kept him alive was connected to something else. The horse, the saddle, the canteen, the fire, the rope, the herd, the weather, the hands riding beside him. None of it stood alone. And when the horse drank first, when the animal lifted its head with water falling from its mouth, there was a quiet kind of gratitude in that moment, not spoken, not dramatic, but understood. Then came the sky. Before a cowboy read the trail, he read the sky, because a trail only told where others had gone, while the sky warned whether it was wise to follow. Clouds could build in the far distance, like dark mountains rising out of nothing. Wind could shift from warm to sharp. Dust could lift in a strange curtain ahead of a front. Birds could disappear from the air. Cattle could become nervous long before thunder rolled. The old hands did not always have formal science, but they had patterns, and patterns were a kind of book. They knew the look of stormlight on grass, the weight of hot air before rain, the smell of water coming from land still dry beneath their boots. A rider who ignored the sky might still have a good horse, a full canteen, and a loaded gun, and still be walking into trouble. That was another forgotten lesson. Survival was not domination. It was adjustment. The land changed, so the rider changed with it. He moved to higher ground. He gathered wood before rain. He turned the herd if he could. He made camp before darkness swallowed the details. Many people think courage means pressing forward no matter what stands ahead. But the old range taught a harder truth. Sometimes courage meant stopping early. Sometimes it meant admitting the clouds knew more than your plans. Sometimes it meant letting pride go before pride became a grave marker. That is why the last light of day was sacred. Never waste the last light. A cowboy who had ridden since morning might want nothing more than to fall from the saddle and let sleep take him where he stood. But the final hour before dark was not rest. It was preparation. It was the hour to choose ground, check the horse, fill the canteen, gather fuel, set the bedroll, place boots where a hand could find them, and look once more at the country before the night erased it. Darkness made every mistake larger. A loose strap became a lost saddle. A poor knot became a wandering horse. A bad camp became a cold and dangerous night. A missing tool became panic. In the last light, the world often looked gentle. The sun laid gold across the grass. The air cooled. Smoke from a small fire rose in a thin blue line. Somewhere nearby, cattle shifted and settled, and a tired man could almost believe the land had softened for him. But the men who survived did not mistake beauty for safety. They prepared inside the beauty. They honored the evening by refusing to become careless in it. And when night finally came, when the stars opened above the plains and the fire burned low, the prepared man could sleep lightly, not because there was no danger, but because he had done what wisdom required before the dark arrived. A fire on the open range was never only fire. It was warmth for stiff hands, coffee for a tired mouth, light against the old fear of darkness, and a small human answer to a world too wide to control. But an old cowboy knew that fire could also betray him. That was why another rule passed quietly from one camp to the next. Keep your fire small. A greenhorn might build flames high enough to feel powerful, feeding them until sparks climbed into the night like restless insects, proud of the heat, proud of the glow, proud of having made something bright in the wilderness. But a big fire ate fuel too quickly. It showed itself too far. It threw sparks into dry grass. It made shadows jump and ruined a man's night vision. A small fire, carefully placed and carefully watched, did the work without boasting. It warmed the coffee pot, dried a pair of socks, gave enough light to mend a strap or clean a cup, and then settled low like a secret. In country where wood could be scarce, waste was foolish. In dry seasons, carelessness with flame could run across the land faster than a horse. And in lonely places, where a rider did not always know who else might be watching from beyond the firelight, brightness was not always safety. The old wisdom was not to hide from life, but to leave no more sign than necessary. A small fire taught restraint. It reminded a man that survival often belonged not to the one who used the most, but to the one who needed the least. And when that small fire had burned low, when the coffee grounds had sunk and the night air pressed cold against the back of the neck, another rule became personal. Sleep with your boots close. It sounds almost too simple to matter, until a man wakes to a horse pulling against its rope, cattle breaking in the dark, rain striking his face, or a snake moving somewhere near the warmth of the bedroll. On the range, night did not promise warning. Trouble did not wait while a man searched for his gear. Boots left too far from the hand could cost precious seconds. Boots left upside down, unwatched, or careless in the grass could hide scorpions, spiders, thorns, or wetness that turned morning into misery. So the careful cowboy placed them where he could reach them without thinking. Some men may have turned them over, shaken them out, kept them under a coat, or set them in a way that made sense for the country and season. It was not fear, it was discipline. A man who lived outdoors learned that comfort came after readiness. He could sleep, but not surrender. He could rest, but not become helpless. In that simple habit, boots close to the body, hat near the hand, knife where it belonged, there was an entire philosophy of survival. Prepare before panic. Arrange your world before darkness tests it. Do not let exhaustion make you helpless. Storms had their own lessons, and one of them was stranger than many people expect. Tie nothing too tight in a storm. A man who feared losing his gear might pull every knot hard, strain every line, fasten every canvas, rope, and tether, as if force alone could defeat the weather. But wind has a way of punishing stiffness. A line with no give could snap. A tarp pulled too tight could tear. A horse tied without room to move could injure itself in fear. A tent fixed without judgment could catch the wind like a sail and fight until something broke. The old hands understood that strength was not the same as rigidity. Sometimes survival meant leaving room for movement. A knot had to hold, but it also had to make sense. A horse needed security, but also safety. Gear needed protection, but also flexibility. The range taught this lesson again and again in dust storms, hard rain, sudden cold, and nights when wind came across the land like an invisible herd. The careless man tried to command the storm. The wiser man worked with it, lowering what needed lowering, loosening what needed give, choosing shelter not because he was weak, but because he knew the difference between courage and foolishness. There are rules like that which reach beyond the saddle. Hold what matters, but not so tightly that the first storm tears it apart. Cattle, too, had a language, and a cowboy ignored it at his own risk. Never trust quiet cattle. That rule did not mean cattle were enemies. It meant that a herd was a living weather vane of fear, hunger, pressure, scent, sound, and instinct. A restless herd could be dangerous, but a herd that became suddenly still could be just as troubling. Too much quiet might mean something had changed beyond human notice. A predator moving along the edge. Thunder too far off for a man to hear. A strange smell in the wind. A rider approaching. A pressure building inside the herd before a stampede. Men who worked cattle learned to listen not only to noise, but to the absence of it. Hooves that stopped. Chewing that faded. Heads lifting together. Bodies turning toward the same unseen thing. In the dark, these signs mattered even more. A stampede could begin with one sharp sound, one flash of lightning, one frightened movement that passed through the herd faster than thought. And once cattle ran, they became a force larger than any single man's will. Cowboys learned to move carefully, speak low, avoid sudden foolishness, and respect the nervous intelligence of animals. The herd knew things the rider did not. The horse knew things the rider did not. The land knew things the rider did not. Survival began when a man stopped pretending he was the only mind awake under the sky. There was a kind of humility in these rules, though no one may have called it that around the fire. The cowboy learned from everything that could outlast him. The storm, the horse, the herd, the dry wash, the dark. Even the smallest habits carried the weight of hard experience. Carry more coffee than pride, the old saying might have gone, because coffee on the trail was more than a taste. It was heat when the morning came bitter. It was a reason to rise before the sun. It was something shared between men too tired for speeches. It steadied the hands, warmed the belly, and gave a lonely camp the feeling of human order. A pot of coffee over a small fire could make distance feel bearable. It could turn silence into companionship. It could give a man one familiar ritual when everything around him was uncertain. Pride, on the other hand, had little practical use when the wind was cold and the trail was long. Pride would tell a man not to ask for help, not to admit thirst, not to stop, not to listen, not to change his plan. Coffee kept him awake. Pride could get him killed. So the wise cowboy carried what served life, not what served ego. He learned that dignity was not pretending to need nothing. Dignity was knowing what was needed and taking care of it before the need became desperation. A horse could speak without words, and a cowboy who failed to listen was never truly alone in his mistake. Learn the language of hooves. That was another rule that did not sound dramatic until a man was far from help, with the sun dropping and the horse beneath him beginning to change its rhythm. A healthy horse had a music to its movement, steady, balanced, familiar through the rider's bones as much as through his ears. But a stone bruise, a loose shoe, a strained tendon, fear, thirst, or exhaustion could alter that music by the smallest measure. One step shortened. One hoof struck the ground differently. One ear turned back too often. One shoulder dipped. A careless rider might ignore it, telling himself the animal would manage, telling himself there were only a few miles left, telling himself that stopping would cost time. But the old range punished that kind of thinking. A small limp could become a stranded knight. A neglected hoof could become a lost horse. And a lost horse could turn a mounted man into a walking man, with distance suddenly growing cruel around him. So the wise cowboy listened through the saddle. He learned the difference between impatience and pain, between nervousness and warning, between ordinary tiredness and the first sign of real trouble. He dismounted when he had to. He checked the hoof. He cleaned out stones. He rested the animal if the land allowed. This was not softness. It was judgment. The old cowboys understood something modern people often forget. The body always speaks before it breaks. The horse's body, the human body, the body of the land. A survivor listens early. The same discipline followed him into his own hunger. Don't eat heavy before a long ride. It was not a rule born from luxury, because there was little luxury in trail food. It came from the practical understanding that the body needed steadiness more than pleasure. A man who filled himself too heavily before hours in the saddle could become slow, sick, thirsty, or dull in the heat. Riding was not sitting still. It was balance, pressure, attention, muscle, and patience repeated mile after mile. The stomach had to live with the saddle, the sun, the dust, and the movement of the horse. A lighter meal, something simple, something that kept without spoiling, something a man could carry and trust, was often worth more than a feast that made him weak. Cowboys ate what the work allowed: beans, biscuits, salted meat, dried fruit when available, coffee, whatever the chuck wagon or saddlebag could provide in the circumstances. Food was not only comfort, food was fuel measured against weather and distance. And there was wisdom in knowing the difference between what the mouth wanted and what the body could use. Hunger could make a man foolish, but fullness could make him careless. On a long ride, the goal was not satisfaction. The goal was endurance. A knife rode close to that life, close as a hand, close as breath. Keep a knife sharp, but use it carefully. The knife was one of the plainest tools a cowboy carried, and one of the most important. It cut rope, opened sacks, shaped wood, prepared food, repaired gear, freed tangled leather, and did 100 small jobs that never became legend because they were too ordinary. But ordinary things are often what survival depends on. A dull knife was dangerous because it demanded force. A sharp knife was dangerous because it demanded respect. A man who treated a blade like a toy or a symbol of pride could wound himself miles from a doctor, and even a small cut could turn serious when hands were dirty, water was limited, and work could not stop. So the old rule held two truths at once. Keep it sharp enough to work. Use it carefully enough to keep working. There was no romance in bleeding because of foolishness. The careful cowboy cut away from himself, watched his fingers, stored the blade properly, and remembered that a tool was only as wise as the hand that used it. In the old life, survival was built from practical respect. Respect for steel, respect for fire, respect for animals, respect for weather, respect for the limits of the human body. Water crossings carried their own kind of deception. Never cross water blind. A river could look peaceful under morning light, with insects moving above it and cottonwoods standing along the bank. But the surface never told the whole truth. Beneath it, there could be mud deep enough to trap a horse, stones slick as oil, sudden drop-offs, hidden current, broken branches, or holes carved by water over time. A thirsty or hurried rider might push forward because the opposite bank seemed close. But closeness was not safety. Old hands studied crossings before they trusted them. They looked for tracks where animals had passed. They watched how the water moved around rocks. They searched for gravel bars, shallow ripples, firm banks, and signs of recent flooding. Sometimes they dismounted. Sometimes they crossed upstream or downstream. Sometimes they waited. A horse could swim, but a horse could also panic, stumble, or be swept sideways by current. A man caught beneath gear and water had little time to correct his pride. The rule was not about fearing rivers. It was about refusing to let a calm surface make decisions for you. Many dangers in life appear smooth from above. The old cowboy knew to ask what lay underneath. Night made that lesson sharper. Listen before you move at night. In darkness, the eyes want to invent things. A stump becomes a crouching figure. A shadow becomes an animal. A rope becomes a snake. But sound travels differently in open country, and the ear can sometimes find truth before the eye. A careful cowboy waking in the dark did not leap blindly into motion unless danger demanded it. He listened to the horse, to the cattle, to the wind in grass, to the crackle of what remained of the fire, to distant hooves, water, coyotes, thunder, or silence where there should have been ordinary night noise. This kind of listening was not dramatic. It was patient. It required a man to master the first flash of fear inside his own chest. Panic makes noise. Wisdom waits long enough to understand. A man who listened could tell whether the horse was merely shifting or pulling hard against a rope, whether cattle were settling or beginning to stir, whether weather was approaching or already upon him. In the old camps, the darkness was not empty. It was full of information. The survivor did not rush to fill it with his own fear. By morning, what a man left behind could matter almost as much as what he carried forward. Leave a place cleaner than you found it. Some may think of that only as manners, but on the range it was also survival. Food scraps could draw animals. Careless ashes could hide live coals. Broken gear, scattered refuse, or a messy camp could reveal too much about where a man had slept and how recently he had gone. More than that, it showed the condition of his mind. A man who left chaos behind him often carried chaos with him. The careful cowboy buried what needed burying, drowned the fire properly where water allowed, scattered cold ashes, packed what could be packed, and left the ground with respect. The land was not a room to be used and forgotten. It was the thing that held every life moving across it. To leave it ruined was to insult tomorrow's traveler, tomorrow's animal, tomorrow's self. There was an old dignity in breaking camp well. The bedroll tied tight, the cup packed, the horse checked, the fire dead, the place quiet again, almost as if no one had been there, except for the faintest memory of warmth. The trail itself could become a liar after rain. Trust old trails, but not too much. A path worn by hooves and wheels might feel like a promise, a thin brown line saying that others had passed here and lived. In open country, that kind of sign was comforting. It gave direction when the horizon seemed too wide. It connected water holes, ranches, crossings, camps, and remembered places. But a trail was not a guarantee. A storm could cut it apart. A flood could move stones and leave soft mud where firm ground had been. Fire could change the landmarks. A fallen tree could force animals into a dangerous detour. Human tracks could also mislead, because not every person ahead of you had good judgment, and not every wagon rut led somewhere safe. So the old cowboy respected a trail without surrendering his mind to it. He watched the ground beneath the familiar line. He noticed fresh washouts, new hoofprints, broken brush, the depth of mud, the absence of tracks where there should have been many. A known road could become unknown overnight. That was one of the hardest lessons of the range. Memory was useful, but attention was necessary. A man could not survive only by saying, "This is how it was yesterday." He had to ask, "What has changed since then?" The land answered that question honestly, but only to those who kept looking. And if the trail had to be questioned, the horse had to be questioned even more gently. Never ignore a limping horse. A man might be tempted to bargain with himself when he first felt the uneven step beneath him. Just a little soreness, just a stone, just a short distance more. The mind does that when it is tired. It turns warnings into inconveniences, and inconveniences into excuses. But a horse's limp was not an opinion. It was a message. Maybe the animal had picked up a stone. Maybe a shoe had loosened. Maybe the leg was strained. Maybe the ground had been harder than it looked. Whatever the cause, the rule was the same. Stop early, look closely, and do not let impatience become cruelty. In cowboy life, the horse carried not only the rider's body, but his tools, his chance, his direction, and sometimes his hope. To ignore pain in that animal was to saw through the branch you were sitting on. The best horsemen were not always the loudest or the flashiest. They were the ones who noticed small changes before they became disasters. They checked hooves by habit. They touched legs for heat or swelling. They understood that rest could save a journey, while stubbornness could end it. There was respect in that, and also practicality. The old cowboy knew that the strongest partnership on the range was built through care, repeated so often it became invisible. Among the small things he guarded, dry cloth was almost sacred. Keep dry cloth sacred. A clean, dry piece of fabric might not look like survival gear to someone living under a solid roof, but outdoors it could become many things. It could wrap a wound, strain dirty water through before boiling, protect the neck from sun, cover the mouth in dust, help start a fire when used with dry tinder, pad a sore spot under gear, keep the hands warm, or give a man one small comfort when rain had soaked everything else. Wet cloth was weight, dry cloth was possibility. That is why careful men protected it inside saddlebags, beneath coats, wrapped away from weather, saved for the moment when it mattered. On the range, the line between comfort and danger could be thin. A wet sleeve in cold wind, a raw blister, a dirty cut, a night without fire. These small things could wear down the body until the mind followed. Survival was not only about escaping great danger. It was about preventing small suffering from gathering into weakness. A dry bandana, a spare shirt, a strip of cloth kept clean and usable. These were not luxuries. They were quiet insurance against the ordinary cruelty of exposure. The same restraint applied to weapons. Know when not to shoot. The Old West is often remembered through gun smoke, but men who depended on their ammunition understood that a shot was never a small thing. A bullet spent could not be spent again. The sound could travel. It could frighten horses, scatter cattle, draw attention, start trouble, or turn uncertainty into violence. A wise cowboy did not fire simply because he could. He knew that a gun was a tool of last necessity, not a substitute for judgment. Sometimes the better answer was to ride away. Sometimes it was to wait. Sometimes it was to shout, signal, circle wide, or keep still. In hunting, a missed or careless shot could wound an animal and waste life. Around camp, foolish handling could injure a friend. Near a herd, sudden noise could become chaos. The rule was not weakness, it was discipline. The man who knows when not to shoot has already won a fight against his own pride. And on the open range, pride was often more dangerous than any enemy. It pushed men to prove themselves when proof was unnecessary. It turned tools into symbols. It made noise where silence would have served better. The old survival mind was quieter than that. It asked not, "Can I?" but "Should I?" Yet silence did not mean suspicion of every soul on the road. Share fire, but measure trust. In lonely country, a fire was more than heat. It was a sign of human presence, and sometimes it was mercy. A stranger riding in cold, rain, or darkness might be offered coffee, a place near the coals, a little food, a few words, and the relief of not being entirely alone beneath the sky. Hospitality mattered because any traveler might someday need the same kindness. But the old hands also understood caution. A man could be generous without being foolish. He could share warmth while keeping his horse watched, his gear close, and his judgment awake. He could speak kindly without telling everything he carried, where he was going, or how alone he truly was. Trust on the range was built slowly, through conduct, tone, respect, and the quiet ways people handled themselves when no law was near enough to matter. Fire could gather good men, tired men, desperate men, and dangerous men. The rule held both truths together. Do not let fear make you hard. Do not let kindness make you blind. Around a small fire, under stars bright enough to make the earth seem ancient, a cup of coffee passed from hand to hand could mean survival. But even then, the wise man kept listening. Food followed the same severe logic. Eat what keeps, not what pleases. A cowboy could dream of fresh bread, sweet fruit, thick steaks, and a table that did not move with the weather. But the trail respected food that lasted. Beans, flour, cornmeal, salted meat, dried fruit when it was available. Coffee, hard biscuits, and other durable provisions mattered because they could endure heat, distance, rough travel, and uncertain schedules. Taste was welcome, but keeping was life. Food that spoiled became waste. Food that demanded too much care could become a burden. Food that traveled well became strength stored for later. The old chuck wagon, where present, was not merely a kitchen. It was a moving line between order and hunger. The cook's work could steady the morale of men who had ridden through dust all day. A simple meal at night could hold the body together and remind the mind that the world still had rhythm. But even away from the wagon, the rule remained. Carry what can survive the journey. Choose what gives strength without making you slow. Do not let appetite outrun judgment. The range taught people to respect plain things because plain things often saved them. And no plain thing was more precious than water. Never ride past water without thinking twice. A young rider with half a canteen might see a creek, a spring, or a muddy tank and decide he had enough to keep moving. The day might still feel mild. The next water might seem close. The horse might still be strong. The map, if he had one, might suggest confidence. But distance in open country had a way of stretching itself. A marked source could be dry. A creek could be fouled. A shortcut could fail. Heat could rise. A delay could turn one afternoon into a night of thirst. So the careful cowboy did not pass water casually. He considered the horse. He considered the canteen. He considered the season, the clouds, the next known source, and the price of being wrong. This did not mean stopping forever at every puddle, but it meant never treating water as ordinary. Water was time. Water was movement. Water was thought made possible. When thirst became severe, judgment narrowed, tempers sharpened, and mistakes multiplied. A man without water did not merely suffer. He became less able to save himself. That is why the old rule had weight. When the land offers water, pause long enough to understand what kind of gift you are refusing. The smallest creatures often noticed change before a man admitted it was coming. Watch the birds and insects. A cowboy crossing open country did not live in an empty world. Around him, life was always moving, feeding, hiding, warning, rising, disappearing. Birds gathering low over a place might suggest water, insects, carrion, or a shift in weather. Birds going silent could mean a predator, a sudden disturbance, or pressure in the air that animals felt before people understood it. Flies, Ants, mosquitoes, grasshoppers, beetles, and other small lives could turn a man's attention toward moisture, decay, heat, storm, shelter, or the invisible changes that pass through land before they become obvious. This kind of knowledge was never perfect, and an old hand would not trust one sign alone. He would not say one bird meant rain, or one insect meant water, as if the world were that simple. But he would gather signs the way a careful man gathers dry twigs for a fire, one by one, until they made a pattern. The trail, the sky, the horse, the herd, the birds, the insects, the smell of grass, the behavior of wind, all of it belonged to one conversation. The survivor was the man humble enough to listen to more than himself. He understood that human beings were not separate from the land. They were late arrivals into a language already being spoken by wings, hooves, leaves, dust, and shadows. But even if a man listened well, even if he cared for his horse, carried water, watched the sky, kept his fire small, and left his camp clean, there was another danger that did not come from weather or animals. Don't let loneliness make decisions. The open range could stretch a man thin inside. Day after day, the same horizon. Night after night, the same stars. Long rides where thoughts grew louder than hoofbeats. A person could begin to miss any voice, even a foolish one. He could become impatient for company, careless with strangers, too eager to reach a town, too willing to ride after dark, too proud to turn back, too hungry for comfort to notice danger. Loneliness had its own thirst. It made the mind bargain. Just one more mile, just one more hour, just one shortcut. Just one camp with people you do not know well. Just one risk to escape the silence. The old cowboy might not have spoken of it in soft language, but he knew the feeling. He knew that a tired mind could be as dangerous as an empty canteen. So he built habits strong enough to hold him when emotion weakened judgment. He followed rules not because rules made him less free, but because rules kept him from becoming a prisoner of mood, fear, hunger, or pride. In lonely country, discipline was companionship. Memory was companionship. The voices of older riders, remembered at the right moment, could keep a man from making a decision he would not survive. That is why the final rule stood above all the others. Respect the land, because it does not forgive carelessness. Respect did not mean fearfully bowing to every hill or storm cloud. It meant understanding that the land was real, and reality did not soften itself for human wishes. A dry wash would flood whether a man believed it or not. A horse would go lame whether the rider was in a hurry or not. A river would hide its current whether the far bank looked close or not. Night would come. Cold would come. Thirst would come. Mistakes would gather interest like unpaid debt. The cowboy who survived was not always the strongest, fastest, loudest, or most daring. Often he was the one who noticed early, wasted little, cared for his animals, rested before collapse, listened before moving, and treated every ordinary thing as something that might matter later. He did not need to conquer the land. He needed to move through it with enough attention to remain alive. And perhaps that is why these forgotten rules still feel alive today. Most people no longer sleep beside a herd under a storm-heavy sky. Most do not cross rivers on horseback or read hoofbeats through a saddle. But the old wisdom has not lost its shape. Do not camp where danger has already left its mark. Care for what carries you before you spend your strength on yourself. Watch the sky before you trust the road. Use the last light well. Keep your fire small. Keep your tools close. Leave room for storms. Listen when living things become quiet. Carry what serves life, not pride. Notice pain before it becomes ruin. Save something dry. Do not make noise just because you can. Be kind without being blind. Choose what lasts over what merely pleases. Do not pass water, rest, or warning signs without thought. And when loneliness, fear, or exhaustion begins to speak louder than wisdom, slow down and remember that survival is often a quiet art. The old cowboys were not legends because life made them beautiful. They were human beings made tired by weather, work, distance, and uncertainty. Their hands cracked, their faces burned, their clothes smelled of smoke, leather, sweat, rain, and dust. Some were remembered, many were not. Some rode for wages, some for necessity, some because the world they knew had pushed them into motion. Around them moved many other communities and traditions, older and deeper than the cowboy story itself. People whose knowledge of land, animals, food, weather, and travel shaped survival across the continent long before the cattle trails became famous. To remember the cowboy honestly is not to turn him into a myth standing alone against the sunset. It is to place him back into the living world that taught him. The horse beneath him, the people beside him, the cooks at the fire, the vaquero skills that came before him, the black and Mexican riders too often left out of popular memory, the indigenous communities whose lands and knowledge were part of the wider history of the West, and the rough, practical intelligence of working people who learned by doing. At the end of a long day, imagine one rider again, not as a hero carved from bronze, but as a tired person under a widening sky. He has chosen high ground instead of the dry wash. His horse has drunk. The fire is low. His boots are near. The canteen is filled. The clouds have been watched. The herd has settled, but he still listens. His meal is plain. His knife is clean. His blanket is dry enough. He does not own the night, and he knows it. That knowledge does not make him weak. It makes him ready. Above him, the stars come out one by one, cold and bright over the open land. Around him, the world continues in its old language. Wind through grass, a horse shifting softly, the far call of something unseen, the last whisper of coals. And in that quiet, the forgotten rules are not really forgotten. They are waiting, like tracks in dust, for anyone willing to look down, look up, and remember that the earth still rewards attention.